Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 5, or Chapter 4. He ended up going to school with his arm only partially healed. Some officers came by and found him, warning him to leave, or he would get in trouble for loitering. Thus, Izuku was exhausted, in pain, and struggling to focus the whole day. He went to his different jobs for the day and told them he wouldn't be able to work until next shift, doing the same with the two he missed the day before to apologize. It was a flat-out gift that the two hadn't dropped him for the no-show. Under-the-table hiring doesn't require loyalty to your workers. Every television he passed that had any sort of news station on it was playing coverage of the All Might slime villain and his monster form. There were specialists, breakdowns, witness call-ins, reaction commentary, and open-ended questions about how to take the information that All Might seemingly got outplayed by some new villain. In class, Bakugo had been livid, but in a subdued way. It was highly anxiety-inducing to watch from a few seats away. The class shot off hundreds of questions about everything to do with the incident. If the student reaction was anything to go by, Izuku's form had been portrayed as some villain that was trying to take Bakugo as some kill mark or something. It made him feel sick to his stomach as he tried to block it all out. The next day was much better, and his week finished out having resumed schedule. If Izuku had to skip a few more meals than usual due to the cash lost, he refused to dip into his tuition money. Then it was nobody's business but his own. That Saturday, he found the filth-covered part of Dagaba Beach. He had a decent amount of muscle already, seeing as he worked constantly to survive, and his cardio was definitely not lagging with a life of running to hide. Even with this as a foundation. That's all it was, a foundation. He would need to work harder than anyone else trying to get into the hero program at UA, since he was working with a healing quirk that would leave him at a disadvantage when used. So Izuku spent the little free time he had to map out the piles of trash as best as he could and work out the most efficient way to remove it all. He had no easy way to remove the larger objects, and all of the small things would have to be carried to the closest dumpster. For now, though, the large objects would be future Izuku problems. He nodded at the page he had used for mapping the beach and setting up his plans once he was satisfied. He would start after class on Monday. The sun was long gone after all the planning, and he needed to find somewhere to sleep for the night. The bullies at school seemed preoccupied when it came to harassing Izuku. School was focusing more on prep for high school and any technical or specialized schools the students were aiming for. This meant that the usual suspects of bullying had their sights on other things for the moment. It wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth, and took the smoother class days to do more homework in class. The more he had done, the more he could work on cleaning the beach. It was a very, very mild comfort to have only minimal jabs and attempts at tripping him in the hall. The trip thing hasn't worked in years, just because he had developed a sort of hyper-awareness of his surroundings, but they still tried and snickered at his little jumps to get over them. The awareness he can't exactly figure out how to turn off, so he just accepts and tries to work around the heightened anxieties it gives him. Growing up with a fear of being discovered when you aren't human does that to people, it seems. Not that Izuku has anything to base that on, but he would imagine fear does that to more than just him. This hypervigilance is what tipped him off that he was actually being watched at the beach. It was week 2 of cleaning, and he felt the prickling feeling of eyes tracking his movement. He did his best not to tense up too obviously. A clear tense would give away that he was aware of the person, even as he moved to try and hide behind some of the trash. He had been one item away from leaving for the night, the sunset on the horizon, but the world never seemed to wait when it came to throwing him a curveball of some sort. Crouched out of sight, he looked around to try and figure out if he could slip off the beach without being seen. He didn't know if it was some person who had found him out somehow. Izuku never came to the beach as the monster, but that doesn't mean some person hadn't vaguely caught the end of one of his past shifts. His breathing picked up as he thought of what it could lead to if he was caught. He had spent too long avoiding it and was actually pretty successful aside from his 2 slip-ups. Close calls were all he wanted to ever get to experience, and even those were a severely reluctant exercise in how fast his heart could race before giving out. There was no telling what the world would do to someone like him. Thoughts spiraling, he almost missed the call. "Young Midoriya!" Izuku's brain stalled out. He knew the voice, but only distantly. It wasn't anyone he worked with or went to school with. There was the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs to the sand. Izuku stood slowly and debated running, but not many people he didn't talk to regularly knew his name. So he stepped out from behind the trash, eyes widening slightly as he recognized the man. Yagi-san? The man beamed down at him as he approached, and waving lazily.
Yes, it's good to see you again. You vanished into that crowd so quickly I couldn't figure out how to find you.
You were looking for me? He nodded. Why? Izuku couldn't think of any reason he gave to be found again beside the obvious. He's a burst of shake in his voice. Is this to turn me in?
Yagi choked and sputtered at the question.
Izuku held back his frown as he felt the sudden growth of pain in Yagi's lung, the spasms of a cough tearing open constantly healing and agitated wounds. He tried to fix them as subtly as he could, but the softened look he got said he failed.
Not at all. I was trying to find you to thank you.
He laughed at the confused look that grew on Izuku's face.
You have been so naturally selfless and driven to help others that it has been reminding me of why I became a hero in the first place. Back when we first met, you were nearly dying, yet the first thing you did was use your quirk to help me. It was truly inspiring. I don't know much about your special circumstance with the creature you can become, but that does not change your innate virtue.
Izuku cleared his throat of the small amount of blood growing there from his quirk use, taking in Yagi's words. What? Why are you telling me this? He couldn't wrap his head around why All Might himself was inspired by someone like him. Surely there was someone else, literally anyone else, that has done more than he has.
Because you said something when I found you in the alley that stuck with me. You said it didn't matter what hero you wanted to be because people would think you're a monster. I wanted to find you to say that it doesn't matter what kind of hero you want to be, because I think you can become the best one of them all.
Izuku blinked at the scrawny man. What?
He rubbed at his eyes roughly and blinked rapidly to clear the static spots flickering from the pressure. You think what? His voice was quiet, not far from a whisper. Yagi grasped the air in front of him with a grin.
I believe you can become a hero. One that the world would loudly recognize for his abilities and ideals.
Izuku felt his own chest tighten in some mix of emotions he hadn't felt in a long while.
And I want to help you get there, young Midoriya.
Tears welled up in Izuku's eyes and he let himself drop to his knees. They felt like they would give out without his permission anyways. He grabbed at the hem of his shirt to ground himself as he focused on keeping a steady breath. This was a lot. No one has ever said anything even close to just faith in his abilities, let alone offered help. No one has ever offered help before, not in any part of his existence. His thoughts were racing so fast he couldn't parse them even if he tried. What do you mean by help? He looked up at Yagi, and the man frantically glowed in excitement that the offer was even considered. A fair response, given how anxiously dismissive Izuku had been when they last met. He pulled out a packet of papers and shook them once so that they would stand up nicely.
I made a work routine that would help improve your abilities all around. You said you have a healing quirk when we last met, so your best option before you specialize is to have a rounded base. I can see you have already started with working on strength training by cleaning this beach. Very admirable, by the by. And if your speed and pace were anything to go by, I imagine your cardio is also strong to start with.
He offered the packet to Izuku.
This has different options and routes to take. With workouts and meal plans, you can show your parents to get the best diet and calorie intake for putting on muscle.
Izuku's face fell ever so slightly at the mention of parents. If Yagi noticed, he didn't comment on it. He wiped away the tears in his eyes and took the packet, flipping it open and looking at its contents. He sighed a little at the time brackets on everything and the weekly layout for it all, but he did appreciate getting a calorie base to work around on the meal plan section. Thank you, Yagi-san. I don't know what to say, honestly. He looked up as he held the packet close.
You don't have to say anything if you can't find the words, my boy. Just know that I would feel greatly honored to help you on your journey and oversee your growth.
Izuku looked at him, really looked, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The glare of a public persona often blinds one from the true personality of a person. It was like both All Might and Yagi were looking for something in this. Izuku wasn't even sure if the man himself knew what he was looking for, but if he could help. there was nothing that could stop him from trying.
Okay.
A fire seemed to light in Yagi's eyes, anticipation for something Izuku didn't understand.
I won't be able to follow the time schedules exactly, but I can do them. I usually come by the beach here after school for 2 hours before leaving, and then spend the nights cleaning on the weekends. You can just meet me here tomorrow. I can show you the times I have free every week, too. We can build this schedule better from that. Izuku got to his feet again and walked past Yagi to put the papers in his bag by the stairs. Footsteps falling in place behind him said that Yagi was following.
Excellent. I will meet you here when you leave school tomorrow then.
Izuku nodded his agreement as he folded the schedule carefully and tucked it into the proper notebook, ever careful to hide the clothes and such as he did so. He pulled the bag on and gave Yagi a slight wave. I'll see you tomorrow, Yagi-san.
The hero flashed him a rather exaggerated thumbs up that actually tugged a small smile onto his face.
Izuku quickly made his way up the stairs, not bothering to finish with the item he had planned to remove before leaving. He used up his time with his interactions with his now possible mentor. He didn't want to give a name to something that wasn't likely to last, not yet at least. He thought about the pages in his bag, and a small, long-extinguished fire sparked to life somewhere inside his being. It had been an incredibly long time since he was working beyond the day-to-day. The excitement was small, but strong. It was enough. More than, even. He wanted to prove he was more than he is, and making it into UA through the same instinctual drive that kept him alive this long may just be a step he can take now.
Yagi was indeed waiting for him when he got to the beach after school.
Izuku watched him tap through something on his phone as he stood leaning over the railing. He slipped his bag off and held it in one hand as he walked out. Hello, Yagi-san.
Oh, I didn't hear you woke up, my boy. How was your school day?
He smiled as he put his phone in his pocket.
Izuku thought about the new burn hole in the sleeve of his uniform coat.
Nothing unusual.
He led the way down the stairs and put his bag down, taking out his scheduled notebook that had the plan Yagi had given him tucked inside. I have my usual weekly schedule written here. He flipped the notebook open to where the plan was used as a bookmark, sitting on the stairs before offering the book to Yagi. They spent time working out a new plan together. Izuku's schedule he had written out just stated he was busy to avoid questions about how many jobs he held. Yagi thankfully didn't question the cluttered schedule at all. A lifetime of work as a hero had him well aware of how quickly time can fill up. It felt strangely open. It had been a very long time since Izuku had sat down with anyone who really took his input seriously about anything. They worked rather intently on it, and when Izuku had to go, it was actually Yagi that had pulled out his phone and mentioned the time. A farewell was exchanged, and a promise to actually get work done on the beach tomorrow was said before Izuku ran off to his first job of the night. They spent the next few days of training mostly quiet, aside from tips and encouragement from Yagi. When Izuku pointed out he didn't own a swimsuit for that option of training, the man just said not to worry about it. They didn't bring it up again. Izuku thought of a number of questions he wanted to ask the hero. Yagi was a walking well of experience and information he could pull from, and it was starting to make Izuku's skin itch in the baseline curiosity he could feel growing. Sunday, he got the nerve up to ask about his injuries. Yagi gave him the story of the injury and consequential surgeries willingly, saying he was actually expecting the question much sooner, and insisting he didn't mind that he asked. Izuku wasn't sure how to take the lack of resistance to his questions, to his mere existence. Even his teachers have been reluctant or completely neutral at best when it came to him doing anything beyond the minimum requirements in class. It was new. He took in the information and nodded as he went back to moving a television. The question exchange became a standard so that both could work out things about the other. If one seemed hesitant about responding, the other took back the question and moved to a different one that came more easily.
How far is the range of what your quirk could feel?
Izuku looked over at where All Might sat on a pile of junk, hunched and grinning as he held his phone in one hand. The strain was minimal, which means he hasn't done much in this form today. I don't know specifics. I haven't had any way to exactly test it, since I would need a partner to do so. The range changes depending on how I am, though.
This got him a raised brow.
The bigger my body, the larger my range.
Ah, I see.
They left it at that.
When you healed me, it felt like you pulled it out of me. Then you got the injury yourself.
It probably wasn't even meant as a question for Izuku. More likely, it may have been aimed as an observation. Izuku hefted the clunky microwave in his arms as he made his way to the truck Yagi had started to bring for carrying the larger junk to the dump.
That's the basics of my quirk, yes.
Well, does your quirk give you the scars they leave behind? Does it leave the scar on the person you heal?
He set the microwave on the tailgate and pushed it back against the pile already there. Izuku never thought about checking to see if the people he healed scarred still. He always healed in passing, so he could never check. How would he even check? Hey, I took your insanely jagged and large injury away. Did it scar still? He didn't think so. As for his own scars, he looked down at himself. He had a number of them. If the wound was messed up enough that even a precise surgery couldn't leave it spotless, he's scarred.
Depends. Also, I've never gotten to ask someone if the healing I do leaves them with a scar still. I usually am trying to avoid whatever crowds or people may be around at that point.
Something for us to figure out in the future, then.
The word us was said so casually and confidently, Izuku almost tripped. Yagi asked if he was okay, but didn't ask about why. The boy stumbled on clean sand. All Might showed up with a few swim trunks in hand one weekend, clad in a swimsuit of his own. Izuku looked at the sizes and took the one that would fit with near stars in his eyes. They were very high-quality drugs and would have cost him months of work just to consider buying himself.
How much do I owe you?
The words were immediate from Izuku. People who bought him things anywhere else always expected the debt to be repaid.
Nothing, my boy. They're a gift.
All Might gave him a thumbs up and told him to change in the nearby restrooms. He would watch the boy's bag. The feeling of swimming in the ocean and not worrying about having to dry his clothing before they could sour his bag was an experience. One that left Izuku feeling the tiniest amount lighter, to the point that he actually felt a small bubble of laughter in his chest when All Might got stormed by a crowd of women that had spotted him from farther down the beach. He looked rather confident on the outside as he posed for photos, but Izuku could feel the hit of tearing in his lungs that came with any sudden amount of surprise in the hero. He healed it with a ghost of a smile on his face.
Do many others know about this?
Izuku was sitting in the passenger seat of the truck as they drove back to the beach from the dump.
About what, my boy?
About you, Yagi-san.
He watched the slight droop of his shoulders and felt guilt rise in his gut.
Never.
A few. A very, very select few.
Izuku saw the distant and somewhat nostalgic look in his mentor's eyes. He understood the feeling. They sat silently, but not tense in the least, for the rest of the drive. When they got out of the vehicle, Izuku spoke up.
Thank you, Yagi-san.
The hero gave him a soft smile.
Young Midoriya.
Izuku looked up from where he was crossing off another cleaned section in his planner.
Why do you not bring food to eat on our longer practice days?
He hesitated. Izuku didn't exactly have a response prepared for that one, like he did with questions about his family or home.
I don't own a bento box.
He purposefully focused on his notebook. He already had the plan inside memorized, so there was no real point to it beyond avoiding contact.
You've never had a bento?
Izuku shook his head as he put the notebook away and moved on to the next block of junk to clean. The lack of further questions along those lines was appreciated. Yagi started to bring bentos to their training sessions. It was about 4 months of regular training and growth before Yagi asked about his monster form directly. Izuku had been wondering if he was just avoiding it entirely to pretend it wasn't there. He wouldn't have blamed him if that had been the case.
So your other form is not a quirk?
Yagi was writing in a planner, tapping a pencil against the pages.
No!
The confident and immediate response seemed to throw him.
How do you know?
The planner closed and Izuku rested his chopsticks on his bento. He went to reply, but stopped. Not sure if he was ready to reveal his close call.
I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that, my boy.
It was a genuine apology, but Izuku just shook his head. He let out a soft sigh as he glanced around the half-cleared beach.
It wasn't erased.
Pardon?
Yagi's eyes widened in shock.
I got cornered by Eraserhead and Present Mike almost 2 years ago. I was in that form, and Eraserhead came around the alley and used his quirk on me. My healing stopped, but I stayed the same. I'm still not exactly sure how I managed to get out of that one.
Did they hurt you?
The air between them seemed to close off nearly instantly.
Can we talk about something else?
Izuku met his gaze, silently begging past the concerned and sympathetic look on the man's face. Yagi closed his eyes with a sigh, the non-answer still telling enough.
Of course, my boy.
Yagi watched Midoriya run down the stairs with an actual smile on his face for the first time. His heart leapt as he took in the sight and felt a grin spread across his own face as his student ran up to him with a slight bounce. He was markedly cleaner than many of their other training sessions. He originally had been dismissing the dirtiness as that strange stage a number of teens go through where they don't feel the need to bathe as often as they should, but lately he was getting the nagging feeling that there was more to it. The boy's hair was no longer pushing shoulder length either.
I got a haircut!
Midoriya stood tall in front of him and shook his head, the green curls shaking wildly before bouncing back to their general original shape. Pride radiated from him, and Yagi couldn't help the chuckle that got out of him.
I can see that, my boy. It looks good on you.
He ruffled the hair with a heavy hand, not much thought in the action at all as he let his hand drop. The way that Midoriya's face twisted into one of surprise, though it didn't seem to be in a bad way, told him more about the boy he was hoping to gain as a successor. Friendly contact was obviously not something he was accustomed to, even when in his normal form. Not that Yagi had any way to be confident this was the normal form for Midoriya, but he had no place to judge. He understood the strange stressors of figuring out which form is the real one when you get too used to seeing yourself a certain way.
Thank you, Yagi-san.
There was a weight to the words, more than what the man expected. He looked at the way Izuku touched his own hair, as if he was still processing the small gesture.
Of course, young Midoriya.
Izuku!
Yagi choked slightly on the sudden surge of blood as his breathing got wrong. The pain pulled away almost immediately, and he looked at Midoriya, looked at Izuku, with wide eyes. Green eyes thinned slightly as he gave him a hesitant smile.
You can call me Izuku, if you want.
He nodded in response and felt a warmth of pride growing in his core. This boy was a gift indeed to have met.
May I ask about your other form?
Yagi looked up from his paperwork he was working on, the last of the work for his teaching position at UA. He may have found the successor he was hoping for, but he was yet to even ask Izuku if he would accept. The boy had a lot going on behind the scenes that Yagi knew he was pointedly hiding out of some sort of fear or learned self-protection. He was thin, but packed with lean muscle, as if just barely meeting the calorie requirements of their plan they had set up. Izuku also never talked or answered questions about his home or family unless it was vague and non-informative. The most he had gotten so far is that his dad left when he was young. Izuku sat on a tire he had kept for a seat in everything and took a sip from the water bottle he had bought him as another gift. Another thing that seemed to shake him. His student seemed to own very little when questioned. Yagi figured he happened to find a boy of poverty, but the amount of things Izuku owned seemed to be beyond minimal. It worried him more often than not.
I guess it depends on your question.
He settled on the tire more, resting in the hole and reclining a bit, gaze turned towards the gray clouds overhead.
I don't have anything specific. I just only ever got a glimpse of it back then. I was curious what all you were willing to share.
Yagi had looked up videos online when Izuku mentioned weeks ago that he had a previous run-in with heroes. It was minimal and blurry, but there were phone videos and 2 CCTV clips of Izuku in his other form. It revealed little to work with, other than that he was much faster than the average hero. Izuku was silent, and he was debating if he pushed a boundary too far, or if he was just considering what all to share. He gave him a few minutes, and the kid let out a sigh that seemed to have more age and exhaustion behind it than Yagi knew what to do with.
I call it shifting. It's fast and it doesn't hurt unless I'm already injured. Going either way. I can become a monster, but just because I don't look like it now
doesn't mean I can't still feel it. I am always a monster because it's part of me, not separate. I'm just hidden better sometimes. I've been able to shift for as long as I remember. Longer than if what my mom said is anything to go by. I'm still in full control of myself and my thoughts when I'm like that. I do my best to hide and only go out at night like that because no matter how hard I try to stay non-threatening or small or anything, people are still afraid. So I just don't let go of this form unless I have to.
Izuku took another sip from his water and didn't say anything more. Yagi turned the information over in his mind. It was interesting, without a doubt, but the way that the boy viewed himself was worrying. It seemed he had no positive support systems for himself. He hoped to change that for him and become one.
May I see it one day?
A beat?
It's going to rain soon.
Yagi looked up at the sky as well at the quiet comment. The weather said it was only a 20% chance of rain this morning, so hopefully it would stay as simply gray skies. 10 minutes later, the first drops hit his arms and he quickly put away his paperwork.
Why are you spending so much time watching me train, Yagi-san?
The question had been keeping Izuku up lately, his mind twisting and warping with doubts and anxieties after a particularly bad school week carrying over a bad weekend into another bad school day. Did his mentor not trust him to follow a plan? Was he waiting for the first hint of lagging so that he could cut any further losses and leave? It didn't make sense to Izuku. No one has dealt with him this long and still kept up the facade of caring. He wasn't sure which scared him more at this point. Yagi not actually caring about his turnout, or Yagi caring more than he logically should based on Izuku's past experiences with people. He was working harder than he probably should be, just to not fall behind at work. His training actually making him able to do harder labor at some of the jobs and earn a little bit more cash. There was a month until the entrance exams. The beach was almost clean. Tips on how to properly stretch and train different muscle groups were few and far between at this point, and yet Yagi stayed. Izuku couldn't figure out why unless he came for the healing benefits that Izuku could provide. That felt out of character for his mentor, though. The fact that he could pick apart what was out of character for Yagi was another thing Izuku was a little ruffled about. He hadn't expected to interact with a hero on positive terms for any length of time that would allow that kind of understanding.
I told you already. I wanted to see you grow into the hero I know you can be. Is that a bad thing?
Izuku huffed out a breath but didn't let his pace slow. Yagi looked at him from the Segway he was riding, something Izuku found distantly funny the first time he saw it, but now rused the existence up for the days that Yagi has him push his limits on running. At least the man carried his bag for him.
Why me, though?
Another question that rattled through his mind every time he saw his mentor. He remembers the description Yagi had given him months ago about how he viewed Izuku, but surely he wasn't the only being on Earth with those attributes.
Because, young Midoriya, I find you to be a true hero at heart.
Yagi stopped, glanced around the empty park, and turned to Izuku. He slowed to a stop next to him with a slight pant.
I have an offer for you, my boy. One I would like you to consider, but are not obligated to accept.
Izuku looked up at him expectantly.
I would like to offer you my quirk. I came to the city to look for a successor, and was not disappointed when I happened upon you. You have truly blown away my hopes and expectations.
Izuku was very grateful that they were stopped for this conversation because he would have hit the ground with the blow of that offer. His jaw worked as he tried to find words, and he knew it was hopeless to stop the tears that fell.
Yagi-san, thank you so much. I appreciate everything you have done for me, but I can't,
He smothered the hiccups that threatened to break his thoughts up even more. Yagi's concern was palpable as he reached toward him. Izuku took a step back, flinching slightly, and shook his head. His head was reeling. The way he has framed his entire self-support and views was being grabbed by the foundations and shaken violently. People don't care about things like him. Stories and ideals were just that, stories and ideals. The underdog rarely won out, and people liked to say they root for them, but in reality put their money on the biggest buck. Izuku was far from that. This didn't make sense.
His life the past few months has been a dream with the safety and comfort Yagi had been providing, but the thing about dreams is that you always wake up. It didn't make sense. I want to be that kind of hero, but I can't. I can't because I'm a monster. I live my life how I do because monsters, they don't get saved. We either hide until we die or get killed by whatever manages to hunt us down. His voice was shaking as he cried, and he wiped at the tears. Yagi had a look that he couldn't figure out on his face. He was breathing too fast, and he knew it. Izuku recognized this feeling. He hasn't felt it come on this strongly in years. He couldn't stop it, though. His thoughts moving faster than he could keep up with, and he distantly registered Yagi reaching for him again, and he tripped over himself in his attempt to back away. He heard ragged breathing that he distantly recognized as his own, and gripped at his own hair with one hand, the other twisting into his shirt. This wasn't how his life was. Izuku wasn't allowed this sort of kindness. He wasn't allowed to treat himself to friendly interaction. He wasn't allowed to be a hero when he was a monster. This didn't make sense. Yagi didn't make sense. None of this made any sense. His vision was blurring, and his brain had stopped sounding like any train of thought and more like the loud ringing of two tense muscles. He just barely recognized a hand grabbing his own and it being pressed against a chest that rose and sank slowly. Steadily, another hand grabbed his other and a thumb ran circles over the back of it. The chest under his hand was rumbling, and a part of him knew that meant there were words he was supposed to be hearing but couldn't. The ringing in his head was still too loud, and he shook his head, hoping, praying that they understood. He felt the tears on his face as he started to cry again. He knew it was just from the stress of the panic his body flung itself into, but he couldn't help the way his mind seemed to huff about crying more. The rumbling stopped, as did the circles, and he found himself floundering at the loss. An anchor removed to leave him lost to the waves. Then the hand that wasn't held to a chest got pressed against his own. He didn't like it. He knew he was breathing too fast, but just feeling the stuttering and short breathing made him panic more. Then the hands tapped a finger against him. It was matching the slow breathing of the other chest. 7 taps as they breathed in, 5 as they held, 7 as they breathed out. It was a steady tap, a constant rhythm, and after what felt like ages, he felt himself falling into the pattern. The ringing faded. Air came to him more easily. The crying slowed and stopped. He must have closed his eyes at some point because he found himself opening them to a horribly distraught look from Yagi. He was still holding both of his hands, sitting cross-legged in front of him, and still tapping out the rhythm on both of them. There was a woman and a child nearby, the mother watching on in worry. Izuku put the spectating out of his mind as he let his mind blank out more, gaze dropping to the ground between him and Yagi, and focus on the constant tapping. He felt exhausted. He felt disconnected from himself entirely, outside of his own body and just pressing the controls of what was needed. He felt like crap, if he was completely honest with himself. He felt like crap, and he didn't even have an injury to pin it on. He tugged his hands away slightly, and Yagi let them go immediately.
Better?
He shrugged. He didn't know if this counted as better. He wasn't panicking, but he still wasn't back to how he usually was either.
Can I talk to you for a moment, my boy? You won't have to respond. Just listen.
Izuku kept his gaze on the stonework of the path they had been taking. Yagi seemed to understand, voice quiet and even, as he continued.
You, Midoriya Izuku, are an astonishingly wonderful person. Well and truly. I don't think I have ever met someone as selflessly willing to help others. You don't look for anything in return, ever. And even when I have offered you gifts, you still find ways to turn around and give something back. You help the people who slip past the radar of heroes. The ability to heal the unseen injuries that people hide out of shame, or necessity, or stubbornness, makes you far more capable than most heroes at helping the public. If you truly have lived your life up till now with the same drive to assist that I've seen in you, you have probably done more in your life for people than a number of pro heroes have done in their entire careers. I talked to President Mike about his experience with you.
Yagi paused and seemed to gauge Izuku's non-reaction.
He told me about how he was thrown at first, seeing something he had no prior concept for. He told me about how it startled him, yet he also felt his injuries he had from the week get pulled out of him. He said you were crying and just asking to be let go. That you came across more like a lost child than a monster like the videos later posted online seemed to decide on labeling you. How you seem to have decided to label yourself. You aren't a monster, my boy. You can be a hero. You don't have to accept my offer. I promise it will not make me think of you any differently, and I will still remain to help you grow into the hero I know you can be. The hero I know you already are.
Izuku nodded slowly, wanting to show he was listening. He didn't look up still and stayed as Yagi stood. A hand reached into his line of sight, and he looked up at it blankly.
Come, my boy, up you go.
Izuku took his hand and allowed himself to be pulled up.
That's more than enough for today. We can meet at the beach tomorrow night. Go home and rest, okay?
Yagi held the bag out to him. He nodded again and took the bag, sliding it onto his shoulders as he turned away. He has no memory of where he ended up wandering to. Izuku was restless as he waited for Yagi at the beach. It wasn't often that he beat his mentor to their meetups, but today he finished his work extra early specifically because he honestly needed to, tonight. When Yagi did arrive, it was still technically early for when they were supposed to meet, and he looked surprised to find him there first. The worry from yesterday was still evident, but Izuku pushed past that. He checked himself over around noon and couldn't find whatever set him off the night before. The only other times he had experienced attacks close to like that were after he got injured worse than normal, severely worse, from taking on more than he was expecting. He didn't understand it, but that wasn't the point. He didn't want to be out in the open right now, and had already picked out the roof he wanted to stake out for the night.
Are you alright, young Midoriya?
Yagi stood in front of him, wringing his hands together slowly, anxiously. Yeah, He sighed, still not sure how ready he was for this. We need to move to a different area for the night.
Oh?
Mm-hmm. You said you wanted to see me, right? Come on, I don't know how long I have right now. I have a roof picked out. He started to lead the way without checking if Yagi was set to follow. He didn't have the time to. He never knew exactly when this happened or how to precisely predict it. The sound of Yagi following closely was a small comfort, though. He was respectfully quiet, and Izuku couldn't decide if that made him more or less nervous. He has never actually changed form in front of someone before. At least not directly or purposefully. They used the alley next to the building to somewhat discreetly scale the building, Yagi powering up momentarily and offering to lift them both up. Once they settled on the roof, Izuku set his bag down a few feet away from himself. He backed away from Yagi too and sat down to wait.
Is this because of yesterday, my boy? Because if it is, please...
Remember when I said sometimes I have to change? Yagi looked to the side and thought before he nodded. Fair, considering it was a rather passing statement tacked onto his explanation of his other form a while ago. He probably hadn't even been that clear. This is one of those times. I can't hold the shift down. It just happens, and I can fight it or fail and let it happen and just spend my time waiting it out. Izuku settled and waited for the feeling that gave way to the change rising.
You said it doesn't hurt you, correct?
He smiled just a bit. Even now, Yagi was worrying when he was about to see him in his full reality. Yeah. He felt the ripple of energy that loosened his grip on his form. Please, don't be afraid.
Of you, my boy? Never.
Yagi gave him a warm smile. Izuku closed his eyes and let his grip get pried away. When he opened them, he only found wonder and amazement looking at him. Yagi was glad he didn't happen to blink, or he would have missed half of the change. Izuku said it was fast, but that was near instant. He was tall as him when he was using One For All, and at his full height. The fur covering him looked clean and sleek, and the bug legs under his neck fiddled together almost nervously. 11 eyes turned towards him and held a more open set of emotions than the boy did when he looked human. In this form, he was exposed, open to the judgment of anyone who sees him, and he had the glaring signs of one who has been met with nothing but rejection and fear and animosity. Izuku showed the signs of being guided into learned helplessness he didn't need to live with. Izuku lowered his head, and the feathers ruffled across his shoulders. The soft sound of them sliding together carried off in the slight breeze.
No ears? How do you hear?
The two feathery wisps on his head pushed forward into a tall emerald V, which got a chuckle out of him. He fanned the flame inside to grow into the hero that the public recognized and pointed at his own hair.
I guess we match, my boy.
He felt lighter with how Izuku's eyes lit up a bit at the revelation and went up in steam to not push his already close limit. He walked around the seated form and looked at how thin it was. Long and stretched thin skin holding his legs in a certain range of movement. The open gashes on his sides had his eyes widening slightly, and he stepped a little closer to really get a look. They opened and closed slightly as Izuku breathed, and that was strangely hypnotizing. The cold fall air was visible through fog lazily rising from each exhale.
May I touch you?
He looked over at the way the antenna leaned back towards him. Izuku let out a rather bird-like rattling sound and settled in his sitting position, a short tail Yagi hadn't even noticed yet sweeping around to sit against his leg. A few of the quills clicked against each other before stilling. Yagi was fascinated, to put it simply. What an incredible child! To have such an ability and still only look to do good in the world. Still try and be good when he viewed himself as anything but. He reached out and ran a hand over the fur on his back, right where a sharp line in his faint patterns split. It was surprisingly soft. The sleek yet dull color gave the impression of it being more wiry, but it had a downy texture. He lightly pushed the fur the wrong way as he moved towards the crest of feathers. They were rather strong, resisting a bit when he pulled one carefully flat to look at it. Some looked more battered than others, but for the most part they looked intact. Izuku warbled as he twisted his head around to look at him.
Can you speak like this?
Yagi looked over the skeletal face, teeth sharp, but they didn't feel threatening. Mike had said the monster was begging to be let go, but the man was eccentric about some of his tales, and it wasn't clear if he meant that literally or not. More warbling. The boy paused and huffed and warbled again, but it sounded a little slurred. Izuku shuffled, the feathers rising and his thicker fur around his head doing the same. He tried again. Yes, it's just very hard. Not built to talk like this. His voice was much deeper than his regular one, the horrible effect making the words sound jumbled on top of the slight slur that comes with the lack of actual lips to form certain syllables. Yagi nodded and smoothed out the fur he had ruffled earlier. This form seemed to burn much hotter than the human body. He could feel the heat easily through the fur. He walked around Izuku and stood in front of him again with a smile.
What a stunning form! You look mythical.
He grinned and looked over the large figure again. He heard his breathing hitch, saw the way his eyes watered.
Young Midoriya.
Yagi felt his chest tighten in sympathy. Izuku's head dipped and tears started to drip down his muzzle, his breath hiccuping quietly as he cried.
Izuku.
His student looked up, tears streaming steadily, not expecting the nickname.
My boy, if this is what you call being a monster, then I am truly afraid of how you could be when caught up in a rage, because this form...
Yagi reached forward, hands moving to cradle the massive jaw that his student had. Izuku leaned forward and met him halfway, eyes closing with a soft whine. It hurt to hear, but Yagi knew it wasn't a sound of pain. It was Izuku allowing himself a comfort he had yet to previously allow.
This form is still just as kind as the boy who healed me under a bridge months ago.